the key concern. So let me illustrate the differences between the old court, the one that we had for 10 years until 2008, and an empathy court. And I want to juxtapose the Michigan Supreme Court of that era with the California court, which addressed the same controversial issue, gay marriage. Whether the same-sex person should be allowed to marry is obviously one of the hottest issues in our country. People on both sides of this issue feel strongly about it. Under our Constitution, such questions are usually left to the democratic process, the legislature. In some states, like Michigan and California, the people have reserved to themselves the right to make laws directly through initiatives and referenda. And that's exactly what the citizens did in Michigan and California after the Massachusetts Supreme Court declared under John Adams' Constitution, which is older than our federal Constitution, that gay marriage was constitutionally required. Across the country, a series of states, including Michigan and California, enacted referenda making marriage between a woman and a man, the traditional definition. Now, in California, the people enacted a referendum statute. In Michigan, the people enacted by referendum an amendment to their Constitution. Now, in both states, people by wide margin supported these initiatives, these referenda. And predictably, those who supported gay marriage did not try to persuade the public to change its views on that topic, but went where? Court. Absolutely right. They went to court. Now, how the Michigan court responded and how the California Supreme Court responded is telling. In Michigan, our court recognized the sovereignty of the people to self-govern and upheld the marriage referendum. In California, the empathy court there took a page from the president's empathy book and struck down the marriage statute the people had enacted. Now, what happened next? The people in response in California passed by a referendum a constitutional amendment preserving marriage between a man and a woman. What happened next? The people who lost that referendum ran to court, and what did they claim? They claimed that the constitutional amendment was unconstitutional. So, frankly, nobody was sure whether the California Supreme Court was going to honor the people's constitutional referendum, but finally that court relented and respected the people's will. Now, I use this example not to advance any personal policy perspective, but to show how empathy courts actually subvert the people's values and our ability to self-govern when such courts disagree with our choices. Now, you can be sure that empathy courts will be very creative in inventing new constitutional rights to impose their personal preferences. Now, in so many other instances, your Supreme Court before 2008 enforced your constitutional rights as they were and not as imagined. For example, since you just talked about the Fifth Amendment, we had a takings case. That's what the last clause in that Fifth Amendment talks about, that you cannot have your property, you cannot have your property taken except for public use without just compensation. In Michigan, in a case called Wayne County versus Hathcock, a decision I wrote, we protected your constitutional right to keep your property from being taken by the government so it could be given to another private entity. Now, if you recall, within about 8 months of our decision in Michigan protecting your property rights, in Washington, in a case called Kelo, the Supreme Court went the other way. They said, well, if the other private owner could raise more taxes, if it's a developer, yeah, I'll take your property and I'll give it to him. So your property rights in Michigan are actually more secure under the state constitution than they are under the federal government. Now, we saw finally, I'll give you one other example of how the former court did handle your rights. In the last presidential election, we saw a lot of election fraud. And the left has attempted to attack protective laws that reduce fraud in every place you can imagine. Here in Michigan, our legislature imposed a photo ID requirement so that when you go to vote, you present your photo ID, and they can determine whether you're the person who's supposed to be there voting. Pretty unexceptional, except the left didn't like it. They challenged it, and in a decision I wrote, we upheld the photo identification law as a valid way to prevent election fraud at Michigan ballot boxes. Now, I just want you to understand that when the rules are clear, everybody benefits except one group: lawyers who try cases. Now, and we all want to know in advance. We want to know the law so we can plan our futures. But lawyers benefit, at least those who try cases, benefit from having chaos. Because if the law is clear, then all those cases on the other side of the line go away. But if there's ambiguity, you can fight about that. And there's another group, the left. The left, who found out a lot quicker and a lot earlier than the rest of us that it was more efficient to wage politics in a rogue judiciary than it is to do so in the Capitol. If you go to Lansing and the legislature, you've got to convince more than half of 38 senators, more than half of 110 representatives, and the governor and all the constituencies they represent. But if you're doing politics in a rogue judiciary, a willing judiciary, all you have to do is convince one trial judge, 2 judges on the Court of Appeals, and 4 justices. And they figured that out a lot sooner than the rest of us. Now, that's what we're facing today. It's going to be an uphill battle to elect 2 rule of law justices in November, because the left is extremely well organized, and just as they did against Cliff Taylor, they will be spreading lies against me as well. However, unless you support 2 rule of law justices, you will be subject to the increasingly empathetic court that we have now. And I want to ask you all, do you think you're going to benefit more from having your Constitution and laws enforced as they were by the prior court, our old majority, rule of law majority, or rewritten by the current empathy court? Now, in closing, I want to give, people always say, well, how do I know what judges to support? You know, we speak in Latinate terms, and we have all these obscure processes, and you don't really know what we're doing. Well, let me give you a handle on that. I want you to ask this question of any judge that you're thinking about voting for. Which justice of the Michigan Supreme Court has the judicial philosophy closest to your own? Now, first, if they don't know who sits on the Supreme Court,